So tonight we're going to have a little discussion. Our discussion tonight is based on that famous quote that history is written by the victors. Or more clearly, history is written by those with the agenda who have the power to change it all. So we know history's all been warped and changed and whitewashed, etc. Today I'm going to talk about a few specific people, because when history can, it will rewrite history and will write inconvenient people out of history. So inconvenient people, a la Nikola Tesla is of course our prime example, how they literally wrote him out of the history books. And it's only been, let's say, the last 20 years where they've kind of been put into a corner where they have to acknowledge him now. And that's mostly, I think, personal opinion. I think that's due to the truther movement of so many people have been talking about him. For them to remain silent, it becomes a huge echo chamber, right? Like he gets to the point where the silence is so deafening that they have to kind of rewrite him back in. But of course they've spin doctorate and they've made him out to be the crazy old man who was in love with pigeons and never had a girlfriend because he was afraid of human hair. And that's the kind of rewriting of history I want to talk about tonight, because we have certain people, they can't rewrite out of history because their footprint is too big, right? Like they've left a massively huge footprint in history. They're far too famous to just erase. So then they just kind of whitewash them. They keep the narrative pointed to very superficial things. So I'm going to take you, I made a PDF to go through some of this stuff. I'm so organized tonight. The young fuckers are like, oh, really? She did that? I know. We're all used to me just winging it, but today I actually was somewhat organized. So give me a moment. I've got to find where I have it. So one of our first characters we're going to talk about is King Henry VIII. Because, as I say in my notes here, right, the modern public, when you show this picture, everyone knows who he is. They look at the picture and go, King Henry VIII. It's the big fat guy who wears the floppy hat, waves a turkey leg around, and likes to cut off his wife's heads, right? Was also known for having a very bad temper. And there's a lot more to the story, because if you actually go and research Henry, there's a lot more to the story on why he had the bad temper. And that has to do with his health and the amount of pain he was in at all times. But here's the thing. Let's talk about King Henry, what they don't know about King Henry, right? So one thing that was a shock to me when I was doing some research on him a while ago, King Henry VIII was actually a very accomplished herbalist, and so much so that he had a full-on apothecary laboratory, if you will, in every one of his castles, and even had a small traveling apothecary set that went with him when he traveled. Everywhere he traveled, he had his stuff. He actually created many recipes himself, a lot of times, mostly treating himself. He had really bad ulcers and sores on his legs. Now, we hypothesize that's because he was extremely obese and also probably had type 2 diabetes, which is why the ulcers would never heal. He was also had a hard time keeping his member in his pants. You know, we have several recipes in his recipe book that are for, soothing his sore member. Yes, apparently he had problems, again, like I said, keeping it in his pants. So there's a piece of that right there. Like, he was himself quite an accomplished herbalist. He founded the Royal College of Physicians in 1518, and he combined the Barbers' Company of London and the Guild of Surgeons Yes, that's right, because the barbers used to do your surgeries too. They did all your tooth pulling and shit like that, because that's what you want. You want a shave and a haircut and a tooth pulled all at the same time. He combined them into a single guild, and actually really, he was the beginning of organizing a lot of the wildly out crazed Wild West kind of medical stuff that was going on. And aided by Sir Thomas More, he oversaw changes in the water supply for the City of London and putting in sewage, because the raw sewage in the streets in London was rather rank. And he is the guy who actually started putting in a more, we'll call it modern sewage system in London. Now, one of the things that's really important that most people don't know about is he passed the Herbalist Charter. And this is a copy of the Herbalist Charter. And it's very important. This is a very important, and I'll explain that in a second. And it reads, wherein the Parliament holden at Westminster in the 3rd year of the King's most gracious reign, amongst other things for the avoiding of sorceries, witchcraft, and other inconveniences, it was enacted that no person within the City of London, nor within 7 miles of the same, should upon him exercise to occupy as a physician or a surgeon unless he'd gone through the examination process. And I'm not going to read this whole thing because it's typical English of that era. In short form, he passed a law saying that you could only do physician type things if you were licensed. Well, that didn't go over very well, as he gets into in this. And I'll post a copy of this. I'll post the article, and I'll post a copy of this for people to read it themselves, because it's quite humorous, some of the way it's written. Basically, he says, listen, you twats, I passed this law in your favor. For the last 10 years, you have done nothing but sue people for doing herbal simples or selling herbs or remedies. Anyone you can put your little paws on, you've been suing them. You've raised your rates to an extortionate level. You refuse to treat the poor or anyone who comes to you who wants to be cured of anything. You will not do anything for them because you want all the money, and everything you do is all about the money. So he passed this. Let me find this spot. At all time henceforth, it shall be lawful to every person being the king's subject, having knowledge and experience of the nature of herbs, roots, and waters, or the operation by the same, and then by speculation, by practice, blah, 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 to cure the wounds, to make the sores, the diseases, the herbs, the ointments, the baths, the poultices, the plasters, etc., etc., etc. Skipping down here, because I'm telling you, this era, 400 words in a sentence, not unusual. To be able to do this without suit, vexation, trouble, penalty, or loss of their goods, the foresaid statute in the foresaid 3rd year of the king's most gracious reign, or any other act, ordinance, or statutes to the contrary, hereforeunto made anywise notwithstanding. This put in perpetuity protection for every herbalist to be able to ply their trade. Fast forward to our modern times, when England was joining the EU, the one thing the EU said to England was, hold on. You can't just be selling all this stuff, because yes, the Herbalist Charter has stood until now. And to join the EU said, you have to get rid of this. And basically, a lot of England went, fuck you, I won't do it, you tell me, basically. Now, England did enact certain new laws, if you will, that certain things cannot be sold unless it's licensed. And that is the list is extensive, but we are on the whole, it is the more dangerous type herbs, plants, etc. So you do have to have a license if you're going to be working with hemlock, as an example. But why is this also important to Americans? When the American colonies declared their independence as sovereign states in July of 1776, they each adopted the laws of England as common law of the state. Among the laws of England so adopted is the Herbalist Charter. This ancient act of Parliament applied to England and the King's other dominions, which included, of course, the American colonies and later the states. This act has never been repealed in the 13 original states. To this day, the Herbalist Charter still stands in the states in perpetuity as a charter of rights. So that's a really, really important little factoid that a lot of people don't know. And we can go into all kinds of other stuff with Henry VIII. There's a whole lot of stuff about his wives and why he lopped off heads and things like that, that let's just say it's not as straightforward as they would have you believe. Not as straightforward as history would like to tell you it is. They'd rather you thought of him as just a fat guy in a floppy hat waving a turkey leg. So our next person we're going to talk about is kind of one of my faves. Not gonna lie. Sir Isaac Newton. And what does the average modern person know about Sir Isaac Newton? I've joked for many, many years that if you could go back in time and find Isaac Newton and say to him, in the year 2023, every person on the planet Earth will know your name. Every school child will know who you are. And then if you told him that the reason everybody knows him is because an apple fell on his head and he discovered gravity, he would be appalled. He would be like crushed. It would be, his whole thing about gravity was so secondary to third area, fourth area, fifth area, to everything that he did. It was so unimportant to him in the greater scheme of things that to think that that is why the whole world remembers him would be just crushing to him. Crushing. So let's talk about Sir Isaac Newton. Who was he really? So he was a mathematician, a physicist, an astronomer, an astrologer, an alchemist, a theologian, a historian, and a natural philosopher. He was the key figure of the scientific revolution, and his Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, or the mathematical principles of natural philosophy, established the classical mechanics that we still refer to this day. It is still used to this day. He evolved several major evolutions in optics, including building the very first practical mirrored telescope, and he developed what is now called infinitesimal calculus, or he developed it with a German mathematician. He formulated the laws of motion and the universal gravitation, formulated an empirical law of cooling, made the first theoretical calculation of the speed of sound, and introduced the notion of a Newtonian fluid. Again, all of which kind of stands still to this day. A little piece that other people don't know, and this is a really awesome one. Newton was made the warden of the Royal Mint and used his authority to completely reform the British currency. He hypothesized that there was a massive amount of fake currency being passed on, or how they would cut the edges off the coins, shaving the coins, to the point of he figured that 20% of the currency in circulation was actually counterfeit. He went undercover himself to gather the evidence himself, dressed as like a worker, a farmer, a market person, went around to all the markets and the taverns and the pubs and collected up all the evidence he needed to completely reform the British currency. He was the first modern scientist to talk about the existence of ether energy, or aether energy, to transmit forces between particles. This is shit that science is only now, literally in the last couple of years, only now starting to admit exists. More importantly, he reintroduced Gnostic philosophy, Hermetic understanding of consciousness, and he questioned a lot of very important religious tenets of Christianity. And he did it without getting burned at the stake. And let's face it, when Newton was alive, it was a time where they really, really did like to burn people at the stake for questioning any aspects of the church. What happened, though? When he died, follow this story along, because you might find some relevancy into the first character I very much mentioned. When he died, they came in and they took his body and they collected up all of his papers to the tune of more than 10 million words written in his notes, and they disappeared. Now, he bequeathed, because he had no children himself, he was never married, he had no children, he had, all his notes were supposed to go to a certain couple of people. In the 1830s, Cambridge University got a hold of all of his notes. They don't actually detail to us how, but they did. And then they spent 16 years cataloging everything that he wrote. They gave back, they kept a couple of things themselves and then gave it back to the person. It was the Earl of something or other. I can't remember, the Earl of something, who owned all these things, gave them back to him. In 1939, fast forward, those papers ended up going up for auction. And they got bought for around £9,000 sterling. And then they fucking disappeared. Most of it disappeared. Now, since then, there's been a couple of people who have been working to find different pieces and bring them out and buying pieces of the collection and getting it put back together. And there is a project called The Chemistry of Isaac Newton. There's been ongoing for like 20 years, but you know what? As much as everyone writes about it, you can't actually find anything out about it. You can't find his notes. I have been searching for ages to find, just give me some snippets, give me something. They all tell you what's there, and they'll have notes on this one site, which is run by Oxford University. I think it's Oxford University, all about it. And they'll say, oh, well, there's this snippet of this where it writes about this in Hermeticism, blah, 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 or chemistry or alchemy, etc. And then there's a link, and you click the link, and there's nothing there. Kind of like the whole story of Nikola Tesla. Isn't that funny how it's kind of like cycles and how they just play the same template over and over? The government at the time ruled that his notes were too dangerous to be put out publicly. And they have mostly remained buried since then. Interesting that. And of course, like I said, they've whitewashed him, whitewashed all of his incredible accomplishments to an apple fell on his head and he discovered gravity. That's what the average person knows about Sir Isaac Newton. My next character, one of my most favorite. If you want a rabbit hole to go down, kind of fun, frustrating, but fun, Dr. John Dee. Of course, modern times, if you look up, do a Google search on Dr. John Dee, you're going to know that he was the court magician to Elizabeth I, and that he was a fake and a fraud. He was completely crazy, and he talked to angels and spirits, and he was just completely a fraud. He was, you know, they make him out to have been more like not the court magician, but the court jester, if you will. And that is so not what John Dee was about. I love the topic of John Dee. And I mean, one day I could do probably a whole show just on him alone. So who was he really? Well, he was a mathematician, a physicist, a chemist, a cartographer, a coder, an astronomer, astrologer, and was well respected for his knowledge of medicine. Another fact that very few people realize, that he was very accomplished in medicine. He studied at Cambridge University and at the Leuven University in the Netherlands, where he studied and became friends with Gerardus Mercator, i.e. the Mercator maps. They studied cartography and navigation together at the university and became best friends. John Dee lectured on Euclidean, I can never say that properly, geometry at the University of Paris while he was still in his early 20s. I think he was 22 or 23 when he was lecturing on Euclidean geometry. He put forward a proposal to Queen Mary, because he was involved with Queen Mary before Elizabeth, and is responsible, even though his proposal failed, he is the one responsible for the first national library in Britain to be open to the public. The same thing, he is also responsible through proposals that he put forward, though they failed at the time. He had a direct relationship with the very first public museum in England because of proposals that he put forward. His own personal library is famous. He owned more books than both Oxford and Cambridge University. Interestingly enough, because he collected very important books. It is very obvious when you read up about him, when you read about him, letters, that you can see some of the letters between him and Gerard Mercator. They wrote back and forth to each other all the time. They talk about books that he had in his library that are now no longer in print. As a matter of fact, there are several really, really, really important books that they both quote from extensively in their letters back and forth, that those are the only references we now have to those books, because those books were destroyed. Now, John Dee at his time had an arch nemesis who was an extreme Puritan, who was against mathematics, he was against science, he was against medicine, he was against, of course, witchcraft and sorcery and astrology and all of that. And he went around and burned books. And John Dee claimed that two of the manifests that were so important to proving one of his points, and this is his point of the ownership of how England owned Canada and America, that this guy went and found them and burned those books deliberately. So his library was incredibly extensive. When Queen Elizabeth was crowned, John Dee was her primary scientific and medical advisor. He was also her chief spy in Europe, and went back and forth to the Emperor of Hungary and the Tsar of Russia, and I can't remember if it was the Archduke of Germany. I'm getting them confused with the titles are hard to keep put together. That he was delivering messages back and forth. And something that most people don't know is the whole Ian Fleming and James Bond 007 came from John Dee, because when he was writing to Elizabeth about whatever it was they had to talk about, he wrote in code that only her and him knew, and he signed them all 007. And that was how she knew it was directly from him. So that's a little factoid that most people don't know about. All the famous explorers of the time, so like Sir Walter Raleigh, Gilbert, they all went to John Dee because his maps and his cartography skills and navigation skills were considered the best in the world. They would go to him and he would draw out and navigate their plans of where they would be going. He is the guy who coined the term the British Empire and the Commonwealth. And he's also responsible for the English adopting the Gregorian calendar. So John Dee wasn't just a flaky guy who did card tricks for the Queen and read poems and talked with angels, etc., and spirits. I strongly suspect that Edward Kelly, who became he's kind of synonymous with another character called Edward Kelly, that Kelly was put on him as his, what's the word? What do we call that? His controller. He was the guy who was put in to muddy the waters, to distract Dee, and to basically bring down Dee's name. to get him involved in stuff that would destroy his reputation. And I believe it was done on purpose and that he was literally put in that position to do that job. John Dee ended up dying a pauper, and we don't really know exactly even where he's buried. He lost everything in one of his last trips to Europe. They broke into his house. They stole all his equipment. They stole all his books. And that was kind of one of the last crushing blows to him, was to come back to England and discover that his house had been basically ransacked and destroyed, and his life's work pretty much just stolen from him, including all those books, all those really, really important books. And he had a lot of important old books on hermetics, on Gnostic stuff, old mathematical, philosophical, really important library that all just disappeared. Now, as a cute little side note to that, one of the other characters, and I didn't do a write-up for him yet, because he's going to get his own show, and that is my favorite herbalist is Mr. Nicholas Culpeper. He is another one that history has tried to erase as much as they possibly could. And in an interesting little twist, to the best of our knowledge, the only one of John Dee's 8 children to actually survive, because his wife and his kids got the plague during one of the big outbreaks, I think in 1560. I've got the dates all wrong. Paul will correct me. One of the big plague outbreaks, his wife and most of his kids died from the plague. He was in Europe at the time. He had a son named Arthur Dee. Arthur Dee went on to be a very, very famous physician. He was the personal physician to the Tsar of Russia and to the Archduke in Germany. And when he came back to England and he got sick, the apothecary he went to see was Nicholas Culpeper. And Nick Culpeper was the one who cured him of his liver problems that he was having. And then later on, Arthur Dee ended up being personal physician to Charles I of England. So interesting the way that I'll wind around there, but I'm not going to talk about Culpeper. Like I said, will be an entire discussion all on its own, because it's not just his writings. He was an amazing character. Nicholas Culpeper was an amazing character when you read what little bit we know about his life, because they've pretty much erased him, even though his book, his herbal Bible, if you will, is the longest printed book besides the King James Bible, is Nicholas Culpeper's Herbal. It has been in continuous print since its first printing. It has never gone out of print. It has continuously been reprinted. But they whitewashed. They had to get rid of him because he's also so inconvenient. So inconvenient to the truth. So yes, history has a habit of just erasing people that are inconvenient. And I think that if you are reading stories at all, this is kind of how my brain works. My brain is a little wacky. I don't have a normal brain. When you meet a character in a story and it really, they grab your interest. Do you know what I mean? Like sometimes there's a character, you read something, you're like, oh, that's really interesting. I didn't know that. Go do some research. Go see what you can find out, because sometimes you're gonna find very cool little bits of information about famous characters. And you'll find out that it's just been whitewashed all over the place. So that's my little presentation. That was my little presentation. So if you guys want, you can turn your cameras on now if you like. We're going to chat. I got a bunch of questions that I've been sent in to me, so we're going to talk about them, and then you guys I'll open the floor and you guys can ask questions too. Oh, sorry. Okay, so Nicholas Culpeper was an astrologer.